So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 4th Annual Delaware Watershed Research Conference. I just have a few quick reminders before we get started. So number one, just please remember to keep your microphone on mute unless you're speaking. If you do need to speak, you can unmute yourself. Number two, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. If it's a question for our keynote speaker this morning, just make sure you add your email address, because if we don't have time at the end to get to all the questions, I will send them directly to Mike. You can also, Mike, you can answer them in the chat if you want to, but there's no pressure. I will send them to you. And number three, our moderator this morning is Mary Bailey from the Academy of Natural Sciences. She will be keeping time and wrapping up at the end. So any questions for me, write them in the chat. I can respond to you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Roland Wall to kick off the conference.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Roland Wall. I'm the director of the Patrick Center for Environmental Research at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. As Catherine said, I welcome you all to the 4th Annual Delaware Watershed Research Conference. I know many folks here have attended the conference in the past. Obviously, this year we're doing it a bit differently. We don't have the advantages of having the Academy's building we're all in one place where we all have a cafe and an auditorium, conference rooms, but none of us have to find parking in Center City. So I think that's the upshot of it. And that would be my joke for the day. So again, the humor portion of our program is probably completed. I think like everyone, we're learning to adapt to interacting remotely. And so please bear with us as we make our way through the day. I think this is the first time we've done a Zoom program of quite this length. So any barking dogs off stage or children crawling onto people's laps, I think we've all learned to deal with that. Today, we're going to have researchers presenting on a variety of projects that support our growing understanding of both the natural and human processes that shape the landscapes and waterways of the Delaware Basin. Most of today's presenters have been doing work that is at least partly supported by the Delaware Watershed Research Fund. For those of you who are not familiar with that program, it's been administered for the last 5 years by the Academy of Natural Sciences with funding from the William Penn Foundation. The goal of the research fund was and is to build capacity and answer questions in a variety of disciplines and organizations that are studying the Delaware and its watershed. We're pleased that we've been able to identify over that time a total of 18 projects to fund with topics ranging from impacts of contaminants on fish, on the natural and side, all the way over to the human issues of economic value of the improved water quality and kind of everything in between. These projects, as I say, have been going on for several years with support from the fund, and we'll be hearing from a number of them today. We're also pleased this year to have an opportunity for several staff from the Academy of Natural Sciences to present on new results from work that was largely driven by the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, another William Penn funded program. The DRWI, which I know many of you are involved with, is primarily intended to support watershed protection and restoration, but it also has a significant scientific component with robust monitoring, modeling, and analyses. The Academy scientists, along with many other partners, have been looking at a variety of questions using DRWI data and concepts, and we're happy to have an opportunity to present some of that today as well. A few more logistical details on the program. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have to tell you where restrooms are or which room we'll be having the coffee break in for this year. For those, you're on your own. I do want to take a second to mention that the format for today's program, given current circumstances, we decided to make things as simple as we could. We didn't want to complicate them any more than they needed to be. So as you can see listed in the program, we're going to be doing a single thread of presentations. We decided not to go with breakout rooms so people don't have to decide between presentations to attend. We also opted for a limited number of presentations this year, particularly to make sure we got in recipients of DRWRF funds who have not yet had a chance to present at previous conferences. So we also wanted to give the Academy staff, who in the past have often acted as moderators, a chance to present their original work. Next year, when we're all hopefully back in person, we plan to have probably a more expansive format. The program today will be in 3 sessions. There'll be a lunch break from 12:30 to 1:30 and breaks between the other sessions. I know Zoom can be pretty exhausting, and I know a number of people will be coming and going through the day, so that's fine. We're going to try, the Zoom link will remain open. We're going to try to keep things on as timed on the program. So please just check to make sure you don't miss any presentations that are of particular interest. The last two presentations of today's program will also be viewed by Drexel students as part of the weekly graduate symposium of the Department of Biodiversity, Earth and Environmental Sciences. We appreciate that our colleagues at Drexel are co-sponsoring these presentations and give us a chance to share this work with students. And we hope that many of the students will also be joining us throughout the day. I want to thank a few folks for organizing today's program. Catherine Longwell at the top of the screen, who's been coordinating the conference planning, will be overseeing today's events. Special thanks for that. I want to thank two of our colleagues, Monet Harbiston and Allison Staclosa, who worked on organizing earlier conferences in past years and set up the frameworks that we're really using today. Thanks, of course, to all of our speakers and presenters for taking the time to be with us today and to share their important work. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us for viewing. And finally, I want to say a special thanks to our sponsor for much of this work, the William Penn Foundation. In the past decade, William Penn has made an enormous investment in the natural and human ecosystems of the Delaware watershed, supporting what is probably one of the largest privately funded conservation efforts in the U.S. Many of us have benefited from the Foundation's strategy of place-based support for collaborative watershed protection and restoration with a strong scientific overlay. So talk a little more about that. To kick things off today, we're pleased to have with us Nathan Boone. Many of you know Nate. He's a project officer at the William Penn Foundation, and his work initiated and supported the development of the Delaware Watershed Research Fund. I asked Nate to join us today and give us his thoughts on the role of this research that the Foundation has been supporting. So please join me virtually in welcoming Nathan Boone. Nate, it's all yours.
Thanks, Roland. I appreciate it. And thank you all for taking your time to join us today. I'm really excited to be exposed anew to the progress you guys are making under your various research efforts, and frankly, also to be just reconnected to this community. I think the results of your research, the science you're advancing, is essential to the progress we're trying to make in this Delaware River watershed, but so too are your efforts as individuals, your contributions as individuals who are part of this watershed protection community, part of a community of over 160 organizations who are focused right here in the Delaware River watershed, trying to advance our shared goals for healthy ecosystems, for clean water, and the strong connections between them. So at the William Penn Foundation, we are operating under a strategic plan to protect and restore the Delaware River watershed, focused on creating the conditions for clean water, thinking about the systems, both the natural systems and the human and political systems that are going to make it possible for us to achieve a goal of clean and abundant water supported by healthy landscapes. That work is significant, in short, because the resource is so significant. The watershed itself is so important for our water quality, for our industry, and for our quality of life. So it can't be ignored. And the foundation is in such a privileged place to be able to bring over $30 million a year in grant making to this system through a series of different investments across different aspects of our watershed protection strategy. So it's a significant investment, and of course the resource warrants that investment. But as important as the resource is, it's even further beset by challenges, right? Challenges that far exceed the capacity of our grant making alone to impact. And it's important to recognize some of those challenges. This is a large landscape with many jurisdictions. It's over 13,000 square miles. Half of that acreage, right, half of that area is directly contributing to significant quantities of non-point source pollution through our developed areas and through our agricultural areas. There's stormwater runoff and there's agricultural runoff that's contributing to the impairments and stresses to the water quality of our streams. The other half, roughly half of the basin, is in forest cover. But there too, we're losing forests at the rate of 3,000 acres every year. That's 3,000 acres of forest we're losing on average over the last decade. And on top of these threats and stresses to our landscapes, there's over 250 sewage treatment plants directly discharging at waste into our waterways, nutrient effluent into our waterways. Over 650 industrial sources of point source pollution. These are paper mills. These are various other like chemical manufacturing plants. You name it. And so it's no surprise that over the 25,000 miles of streams that comprise the Delaware River watershed system, almost half of those streams are listed as impaired from one of those sources or another. So the stresses and challenges are significant. And with a goal to see clean, abundant water supported by healthy landscapes, a North Star that ambitious, I hope you're getting some appreciation that funds are limited. The resources the foundation is able to marshal, but even the resources that our partners are being able to marshal, that the nonprofit community is so adept at cobbling together, right, from the various grant programs, various public and private sources of support. It's not enough. It's not enough money. And so we really have to get it right. When we invest in the Delaware River watershed, we have to get it right. And that's where the scientific research that this community is engaged in is just so important, right? Science is the underpinning and the basis for each of these investments in protecting and restoring our landscapes and our ecology. It's scientific research that's telling us where and how to fund, which practices to implement, how to adapt those practices to a constantly changing, constantly dynamic system. So again, so important to have this role and this prominent role for research in this work of watershed protection. I have to acknowledge our hosts and the other partners here, our hosts at the Academy and the other partners who are participating in the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. This real place, as Roland mentioned, this place-based effort focused on the ground protection and restoration of our landscapes and ecosystems. I think this work really exemplifies a lot of what we strive for when we talk about applied research, applied science, applied data. And you'll hear and have opportunities to hear about some of that work today from the Academy and other partners in the initiative, where you heard me mention the importance of those point sources and those different landscape conditions. And it's just so essential for us to understand how to cite and understand the impact of the agricultural best management practices that we're advancing to try and impact water quality. And Lynn Perez will be sharing on that. The forest uses of the forest use and forest cover in the basin. As we invest in the protection of those forested landscapes, it's so important to understand which are under threat, which are under the greatest threat, from loss due to shifting climate paradigms or due to deforestation, clearing, and development. The work that Claire Jantz is doing is going to, I think, cast a really interesting light on those issues. And as we approach this place-based work, goal setting is also really important, trying to understand where and how, what magnitude of effort, how can we set goals and work towards those goals, see meaningful progress towards those goals. And the work that Steph Kroll will be sharing with you, is a great window into that perspective. Because that goal setting work, the other thing I have to recognize, right, is that the practice of place-based conservation, it's so essential. But it's also really slow. You'll also hear from practitioners reflecting back across like decades of investment in monitoring and tracking the quality and progress of their ecosystems. The progress is important. It's often incremental, but the other factor here, right, is that we are running out of time. There just simply isn't enough time for us to continue to pursue an incrementalist approach to place-based improvements in these landscapes. $30 million simply isn't enough funding to do what we know needs to be done. And so I invite you to think with me about not just the value of the place-based conservation, not just the value of this applied and integrated research and science, but also the value of our policy tools. The only way we're getting to impact at scale is through progressive policies and collaboration with our government partners. marshaling the resources of government in partnership with the private sector, the non-governmental sector, for-profit and not-for-profit, to see the kind of transformation and change that we know is necessary for this system. So whereas we go through the day to day and hear about the importance of floodplain projects and floodplain ecology from partners like Peter Claggett, we need to simultaneously be thinking about how to connect those findings to FEMA's funding practices. And $500 million was just announced a couple of weeks ago for flood mitigation efforts. How do we ensure that that funding is supporting the floodplain reconnection and restoration work that we know is so important to a healthy and functioning system? Or there's research that's part of this community about temperature sensitivities for our streams and temperature impacts. How do we make sure that research on temperature is directly informing and plugging into the stream designation process and the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and our other departmental agencies across the 4 basin states? Those water quality standards that are being set to protect those temperature sensitive populations like trout and other species, knowing that a new climate regime is already here and coming. And that our water quality protections, our standards have to reflect that. So integrating that science into our policies, integrating with our government partners to collectively reach the scale of impact so necessary for the challenges I discussed earlier. And so in closing, I want to acknowledge that this can be a challenging conundrum for our science partners who pride themselves on the unbiased approach to their work. And here I urge you, it's time to inject some bias into your practice. And I know, no bias allowed. This is objective science only. But I say to you all, inject bias into your practice, and that bias needs to be for and on behalf of science. Scientifically credible decisions, scientifically credible and backed and justified courses of action. We may be rocked about in a tumultuous public debate about the role of science and fake news, fake science in the public discourse, but the practices speak for themselves, regardless of whether you believe in the narratives around masks in a time of COVID. Masks are saving lives, and the science shows that. So with the strength and backing of the rigor behind your research, your efforts, I hope you'll find new strength and new energy to go out and engage in these policy debates, in these conversations, without compromising any of the integrity of your research, but just ensuring, right, that research is reaching the people and influencing decisions that it needs to. So with that, thank you all again for joining with us today. I'm really excited to see the developments of these projects that I know have been years in the works, and I really appreciate it again. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Nathan. That's a great segue to our keynote talk. Actually, we've in this conference in the past and now is really intended to highlight the role of conservation practice and the applications of the research that's being discussed. Today's keynote speaker has a long and extensive career working in the interface between science, policy, and practice. Mike Slattery leads the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's work in the Delaware River watershed. In that role, he's developing the Delaware River Watershed Conservation Collaborative and administering the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund, which I think all of us are familiar with. He was previously the Science Applications Chesapeake Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service and has spent over 30 years as a conservation professional working in federal, state, and nonprofit settings. It's my pleasure to welcome this year's keynote speaker, Mike Slattery. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Roland, for the very kind introduction. As you can see, the title of my talk this morning is Making Sensible Use of It, and that's the role of applied science and watershed conservation partnerships. When I was first asked to join you all today, the topic was generally framed to me as the importance of science and decision making broadly, and I thought, wow, what a time to speak on that specific topic at this really peculiar moment in time, as Nathan just alluded to, just days before an election, representing myself as a federal official, no less, and with high-profile public policy issues that hinge on the very subject being debated in full public view. I mean, what timing? It's an extremely important topic at any time, but especially now. Wildfires rage in the West and violent storms batter our coasts, yet some of our nation's leaders and too many of the people in our communities still question the reality of climate change as an existential threat. The coronavirus pandemic has cost a lot of lives, way too many lives, and yet many in our society won't even adopt simple, objectively scientific and medically responsible recommendations to keep one another safe. It's enough to have caused the New England Journal of Medicine to get political and urge that US leadership be voted out of office. Scientific American, too, a bastion of impartiality and academic objectivity. They were compelled to endorse a political candidate for the first time. These are both firsts ever, actually, in the 208 and 175-year histories of those publications. It's alarming and it's sad that so many in our society today don't see basic scientific recommendations as legitimate because they only view them through a political lens. And it's sadder still that some of our leaders use that fact to sow doubt. As I said, it's an important topic, but the importance of science to decision makers isn't now, nor was it ever really in question. As we've heard, the current national dialogue about the need for science to make informed decisions about almost every aspect of life is literally a matter of life and death. And yet that national dialogue doesn't seem to reflect a healthy separation of politics and science. And more importantly, it's conflated, it's confused and weakened the very necessary relationship between policy and science. We've recently experienced a series of very public and very high profile repudiations of scholarship and knowledge that is unlike anything that I can recall. Somehow, incredibly, being dismissive of science and expertise has become popularized in a huge segment of our society. And it's a tragic development. We know it's already had a lot of tragic consequences. And this is unfathomable to me, and I'm sure that it's true for all of you too. But these are all indications that using science to inform our decisions is more important than it ever has been before. We can have faith, I think, that the importance of science in decision making isn't really a matter of debate. Scientific advice may not be heeded often enough by some powerful decision makers, but that doesn't make it any less important. As Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the nice thing about scientific fact is that it's true whether you believe in it or not. So let's leave the bigger discussion about the erosion of science's influence on American public policy for another time. I know I'd be preaching to the choir on that anyway, and I'm honestly a little out of my depth in that broad category. So instead, I'll offer my perspective as a natural resources manager and share some observations as a decision maker, specifically as the point person for the Department of Interior coordinating our work under the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. And it's in that particular role too that I'm grateful to be able to work with the Academy. It's a great privilege to work with the Academy in the ways that we now are able to do, working toward ecological, economic, and social viability and sustainability in the Delaware watershed. My agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is established in federal law and regulation by definition as a science-driven agency. So it stands to reason that science-based decision-making is also central to the partnerships that we help support. It's certainly true as it pertains to conservation partnerships working at really large scales, in this case, the scale of the Delaware Basin. But it's also true of our work at smaller nested scales within larger landscapes and watershed settings. I mean, intuitively, we know that our work at landscape scales is comprised of work at smaller and intermediate scales. But we all, I think, could be more intentional about connecting our work across these scales in terms of the ecological, social, and economic objectives that both transcend and connect them. We and our partners aren't always, I think, as attuned as we ought to be to connections beyond the scale of our day-to-day tasks or our individual organizations' missions. When we think about unprecedented threats, though, like bigger and hotter wildfires and increasing sea level rise, more frequent and intense coastal storms, these things that we know are associated with climate change. And when we think about the rate and manner of land use change associated with human population growth, it really drives the point home. We need to connect our work at multiple scales to address these threats, and we need a strong foundation of sound science to do that effectively. Next slide, please. In my career, I have worked, as you heard, in state and federal government agencies and also in the nonprofit sector. And in all those roles over more than 30 years, I've been involved in several large regional partnerships of various kinds where we have shared in the development and refinement of science to guide the mutual work. These partnerships include migratory bird joint ventures like the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. That's a regional partnership of 16 state wildlife agencies from Maine to Florida. It includes the territory of Puerto Rico and several federal agencies as well, along with many NGOs. Regional fish habitat partnerships like the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership. That includes 35 different state, federal, tribal, and NGO agencies and organizations. Watershed compacts like the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, perhaps is a bit more familiar to all of you, being quite a bit closer to home. And more recently, landscape conservation collaboratives, or LCCs, which were a network of geographically expansive science partnerships. And I'll say more about LCCs in just a little while. But all these partnerships have served effectively to establish, among other things, shared science priorities across broad multi-jurisdictional areas. They're often well-funded, but even if they're not, in many cases, the members have been known to pool whatever scarce funding they already had available in order to address some of their more urgent science needs. As one example, every state fish and wildlife agency in the Northeast has agreed collectively to dedicate 4% of their state wildlife grants apportionment to a regional conservation needs program, which exclusively funds pressing science needs that they have prioritized together and addresses those at the regional scale. It's a science funding only partnership, and they've taken their existing funding and pooled it to address those needs. In addition to generating science, though, these partnerships and their member organizations also apply it to inform all sorts of resource management decisions. Always, 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 all aspects of the decision-making by these kinds of regional partnerships, whether they're prioritizing their science needs or deciding where to do the work on the ground or anything in between, all aspects of the work are based on the shared development of science to address mutual needs that are beyond the scope and the scale of individual member organizations. Science is the foundation of their work, always. And this is what we envision for the network of partners working to restore the Delaware River watershed as well. Next slide, please. I made a reference to the LCCs a moment ago, and for those of you who may not be familiar, LCCs, or Landscape Conservation Collaboratives, were a network of landscape ecology and climate science partnerships. The LCC network was established in 2010 with the main objectives to facilitate conservation science collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries, to develop shared priorities and common science needs, and to create conservation strategies to be implemented by the participating partners. There were 22 LCCs in all, and they were coordinated by a small team at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, organized as a brand new, then in 2010, brand new science applications program, and that's who I work for now. Those 22 partnerships covered all of North America, big chunk of the Arctic, all the way down to the South Pacific Islands, very expansive. And I actually stepped into my current role at the Fish and Wildlife Service to be part of that work. The appeal of standing up new science partnerships to take on unprecedented challenges like climate change and to try to forecast related landscape ecology and land use change was just too much for me to resist. So I left the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to become part of a brand new science applications program, working to stand up the LCCs. And that was 10 years ago. Certainly a lot has changed in the last 10 years. The overarching vision for the LCCs was, next slide please, landscapes capable of sustaining natural and cultural resources for current and future generations. And the vision was supported by a science objective to ensure that, quote, natural and cultural resources are conserved at large landscape and seascape scales, guided by the collaborative application of science, experience, and cultural or traditional ecological knowledge, and the generation of new conservation knowledge. Next slide, please. The Delaware Basin is within the boundaries of two of the former LCCs. It crosses the boundary between what were the North Atlantic and the Appalachian Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. Like most of the other LCCs, they focus attention on science needs to address climate change and changing land use, and they develop tools to forecast changing landscape conditions with respect to important ecological processes. They keyed in on elements needed to support both natural and human communities, but over really long time horizons, a century or more, so multiple generations. Next slide, please. And in 2016, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine performed a review of the LCC network at the 5-year mark. And their task was to evaluate the purpose, goals, and scientific merit of the program within the context of other similar programs like joint ventures and fish habitat partnerships, which I've already mentioned. And they were also determined whether there have been, at that time, measurable improvements in the health of fish, wildlife, and habitat as a result of the program. Unsurprisingly, the committee concluded that the nation must take a landscape approach to conservation, and they concluded that the Department of Interior was justified in addressing the need with the landscape conservation cooperatives. And much more detail and specific recommendations can be found in the final report, and that's available at the link shown here. The year the report was published, 2016, was also an election year, if you recall. And unfortunately, since 2017, we no longer staff and coordinate LCCs. In most instances, LCC partnerships, including the North Atlantic and the Appalachian LCCs, which encompass the Delaware Basin, have unraveled without the direct support and coordination from Fish and Wildlife Service. Thankfully, though, the science products we developed in those early years are still being curated, updated, made accessible for various applications. All that's being done by our science applications team, which remains intact. So clearly, we place a big premium on using science to inform our partnership coordination and our landscape conservation decisions. So now let's focus on the significance of our role in the Delaware River watershed. I know most or all of you are familiar with the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. It was enacted as federal law also in 2016. A lot was happening in that year, and it directed us, Fish and Wildlife, to establish a watershed-wide restoration partnership. It's also the basis for the federal appropriations that support the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund grant program. The law also makes several direct references to these other kinds of science and management partnerships that I've been speaking about this morning, the joint venture partnerships, the fish habitat partnerships, and the LCCs. The law identifies them specifically as models to consider as we establish the restoration partnership that we're now calling the Delaware River Watershed Conservation Collaborative. Fish and Wildlife is the lead federal agency for coordinating and implementing the provisions of the law, and some of the language in the law is a nod to an adaptive management framework for how we, our agency, uses science to inform resource management decisions. We refer to it as Strategic Habitat Conservation, or SHC. That's really just a branding term. It refers to our conservation approach that we use with our partnerships, particularly with state fish and wildlife agencies, but within other partnerships as well. Next slide, please. There's more to it than this, but this simple model essentially illustrates how we approach partnerships that rely on adaptive management grounded in assumption-based research. It's shown here alongside some language from the law. The model shows that assumption-based research is a major driver, with outcome-based monitoring and biological planning and science-based conservation design as codependent science elements in the adaptive management cycle. Now, the terminology from the law that is to the right here implies evaluation science, performance metrics, data science and data management, use of information technology and spatial information. It was all spelled out explicitly and intentionally in the law to convey a commitment to adaptive management with scientific rigor. It's not in the law by accident. We made sure it was to be included, and we were leaning on our successful experiences with those other regional scale science and management partnerships when we insisted that it be included. These underpinnings also influence the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund grant program. And again, the law also directs us to administer that grant program, which we do in partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Initially, our grant making is focused almost exclusively on projects that are in the conservation delivery part of that SHC model, the work on the ground, and that's been a focus more than we have focused on the science needs so far. Now that's changing though, as prominent partners now are calling for us to focus more on the assumption-driven research, the biological planning, the conservation design work, and we agree that that shift is needed now to ensure that the projects that we've already funded and the ones that we'll continue to fund are strategic, are connected to a bigger context, and are supported by the science. In fact, some of you here today have already received some funding from the fund, from the DWCF, for some important scientific investigations to help make those kinds of connections. All along, we have tried to stress connectedness, though, to a landscape context in all of the grant making that's already happened in the first 3 years. That kind of foreshadows the need for us to focus more attention on the conservation design part of that strategic habitat conservation model. For instance, the annual grant solicitation has encouraged applicants to use a set of science products and decision tools called Nature's Network to guide the development of their proposals. Next slide, please. The science resources of Nature's Network were developed at a big scale, the scale of the entire northeastern US, and included the Canadian Maritimes. And it was done in response to climate change and other large-scale ecological stressors. We worked really closely with a team of partners from 13 different states to develop this. It included all 4 states in the Delaware River Basin, as well as several NGOs. There were more than 30 partners in all. And the team worked for almost 2 years to develop regional tools that provide a foundation for unified conservation across that huge region, all the way from the Canadian Maritimes down to Virginia. And we used innovative modeling that was developed by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, along with the Nature Conservancy, and collectively agreed on a design that identifies a network of places to help define the highest conservation priorities in the region. The work reflects a consensus from scientists across the Northeast, as I said, including many from the Delaware Basin. And it represents a shared vision and offers a practical set of tools to help people working at different scales contribute to big regional conservation goals, while they are still able to meet the goals of their individual organizations. So, and more than just maps, Nature's Network offers a suite of decision support tools representing several related conservation approaches. Next slide, please. Used together or individually, the tools that Nature's Network offers help us do several things. The best place to start strategic conservation is to identify a network of connected, intact, and resilient places or habitats for key species. These are places that we could target when we're considering future restoration needs in the Delaware Basin, and it'll help us conserve the irreplaceable. Projections about how land use and environmental changes will affect natural resources over time can help us invest in work that's more likely to withstand or adapt to change. So we can target our investments in on-the-ground conservation work better. We can make better decisions for the future. Guidance around science and supported by broad partner buy-in allows more efficient use of limited time and money, so we can maximize our limited resources. Seeing how local conservation efforts fit into the bigger regional picture can help connect local, state, and regional priorities together. So by zooming out or zooming in, partners working at any scale can discover important connections across scales, and that'll help us support local priorities within regional perspectives. With the benefit of consistent regional information like this, we can also look across state borders and find opportunities to work together at scales that are beyond the scope of any single partner. These are the scales that really matter. So it makes sense that we've encouraged prospective grantees to use these science resources. Next slide, please. Here are some specific Nature's Network products. They're maps, of course, showing a network of terrestrial and aquatic cores and connectors. The design, the composite on the right, was built using models for things like index of ecological integrity, ecological resilience, both short-term and long-term, landscape permeability, climate change, of course, several climate models are in there, important biodiversity layers, all that and much, much more is under the hood. And it's all stratified by HUC level and by county boundaries, so it can be sliced and diced in a whole bunch of different ways and applied at different scales to meet specific needs. That composite on the right just shows the Northeast regional design. The design too was developed for the entire Northeast region, but here it's been clipped to the Delaware watershed. It's a great starting point, but since it's at that huge scale, the entire Northeast, it doesn't really speak to the finer scale ecological and social conditions that are unique to the Delaware Basin. And it doesn't reflect the value preferences or weighting of variables by decision makers right here in the watershed. So to me, that's still a glaring need. It's a good building block, but it's not the only one. It's a good one as we begin shaping a big vision and strategy for science-based restoration and protection. while I'm on the subject of the big vision and big strategy, let me share where we are on that front, because it's pretty relevant to the bearing science we'll have on some upcoming decisions. We're going to need input, as I said, at scales relevant to the Delaware watershed from scientists and managers who work right here. And a notice of funding opportunity is now on the street. It was published this morning, and it'll allow us to begin building a basin-wide strategy or a conservation blueprint, which is also called for, by the way, in the law, in the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. It was posted today, as I said, and it closes, I think, on November 23rd. We are seeking a facilitator or manager to lead a scoping process with partners across the watershed to discern what data and information a so-called Delaware River Watershed Conservation Blueprint should contain. This scoping process will review and classify what relevant plans and data sets already exist in the basin that can best inform the planning process. And it'll also identify the technical providers within the basin who are qualified to create a conservation blueprint like this. And we hope it'll recommend a technical partner to actually build the blueprint, along with the necessary supporting data, the decision tools, the key performance indicators, a framework for collecting and organizing data, et cetera, et cetera. So we envision the blueprint being also a suite of resources and decision tools to be used as the basis for setting priorities, investing resources, and more. It'll help us make decisions together about where to work and what to do. It is not expected to be a one-off, at least I hope it won't. I expect it'll be iterative, and I hope it'll be used to guide joint operations by partners throughout the watershed. I don't expect it to become the exclusive strategy or plan, but certainly I hope it will be a useful one and a prominent one, maybe even a definitive one. In addition to a comprehensive blueprint, our emerging collaborative will need a formal science advisory group of some kind as an ongoing component of partnership operations. Some of you may have seen the short presentation I made at the Watershed Forum a couple weeks ago when I described our efforts to establish a strategic partnership, this conservation collaborative that I mentioned. I talked about the need for structure and governance to better define operations for the collaborative then, and all that's still in development. As a part of that presentation, though, I shared a conceptual partnership structure. Next slide, please. And here that is again. It's just a concept at this point, but the science capacity placeholder, as you can see in the lower right-hand green box here, is really important to key in on. Our collaborative certainly should have some sort of formal science coordination, technical advisory, or science and data management group. We don't know exactly what form that's going to take yet, but I'm advocating that we need one. And of course, we haven't received any pushback on that. We just haven't developed it yet. It's not going to be completely our call. It'll be a collective decision made by the partnership as a whole. But I've never known one of the big regional conservation partnerships like this to, at a scale like this, to not include a standing science and technical advisory component to coordinate across the scientific community. It's a way to identify and prioritize science needs, and also to advise the steering committee, also shown on this conceptual graphic here. These are the decision makers, and it'll be important to advise the decision makers on how to address those science needs. Another specific role that a group like this would help us undertake is the application of scientific information to measure progress toward achieving our shared goals. Carol Collier said in a recent presentation, also at the Watershed Forum, in fact, that monitoring and assessment work, the data management associated with measuring the impact of our work is, quote, the backbone of our science. And I couldn't agree more with her about that. This is the data science that's so integral to our work and to our success. If monitoring, analysis, synthesis, science translation, funding for all of it, if all of that is not intentionally prioritized at the outset of these partnerships, it's incredibly difficult to generate later on. And working at such larger scales makes it all the more difficult, right? I mean, with all the different state agencies in all 4 states and all the federal agency jurisdictions, all the different NGO partners at these scales, it's really important to standardize frameworks and protocols for data collection and interpretation for the pure sake of efficiency. But that kind of networking and standardization at that scale is really hard to do. There's a multitude of partners spread out over a really big geographic area, and it makes it really, really hard. So it's important to acknowledge that. and also to acknowledge that individual partners that are working together in a network like this are sometimes obliged to fulfill our own individual needs in pretty parochial ways. We have to. So there's a need for a strong science group to help us figure out how to address the need for shared data collection and management standards that are consistent across the watershed and still honors the individual organization's needs in ways that don't add unreasonable additional workload and cost burden. So that is not going to be easy, and we're counting on you and others to help us do that. Of course, we can take some cues from other watersheds and other partnerships within this watershed where these functions are built into the structure of the partnership, where there are specific goals for collaboration among science providers doing the monitoring, the modeling, the analysis. There are examples that I know of integrated monitoring networks and data integrity work groups and similar partnerships, both in other watersheds, as I've said, and within this one that we can draw from as we go about building that group. So we're aware of the ongoing inventory monitoring, assessment, and evaluations efforts that are going on right here in the Delaware Basin. We already share, in fact, some of the metrics being used by partners, funders like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the William Penn Foundation, others involved in projects supported by Hurricane Sandy funding. So moving forward, we really need to think about how best to build from those efforts, not to do something brand new, not to start from scratch, but to build from those efforts and align them to work toward shared standards and a shared system for measuring the impact of our work together. It's important, really, for our emerging collaborative to have independent scientific advice from you all and from various sources. We definitely need to make space for this conversation as we consider how these types of functions will operate and organize within our new collaborative. And working with respected academic institutions like the Academy also bolsters our credibility in the collaborative too, especially since there are so many government agencies represented. I'm not being snide when I say that. We know that public confidence in science generally is getting shakier, but confidence in government science has suffered the most, I think. People generally trust scientific findings of independent academic institutions way more than they trust science they perceive as having come from scientists who happen to work for the government. That's not only my opinion, it's backed up by data. In fact, there were a couple of articles presenting some of that data in National Geographic and the Washington Post just last week that attested to this. So we in government science roles, we need you in academia to help improve our credibility. The takeaway here is that we're going to need an organized science advisory component in our partnership. It's imperative if we want to know that we're making progress toward our mutual goals, if we want to remain relevant and credible to the public, and if we want to know for ourselves that we're making a difference in people's lives, because that's why we do the work that we do. But it's important for more than just keeping stock of relevant science trends. I also see this group in our case as making sense of a science continuum of sorts for the partners. And here's what I mean by that. New science investigations, the novel research is always going to be critical. But equally important are the scientific analysis, the science synthesis, the science translation, the science delivery to those whose decisions will be improved by it, and the facilitated application of that science to help resource managers make important decisions. We can't do any of that without your help. That whole continuum is really important. If our experience with the landscape conservation cooperatives taught us anything, it taught us that availability of cutting-edge science by itself is not enough. Most organizations and agencies, when faced with tough decisions, really need to be shown how best to apply the science that's available to us. We need to be shown or taught how we can make sensible use of it. Next slide, please. So here's a favorite quote by Albert Einstein. This one I've really taken to heart. Why does this magnificent applied science, which saves work and makes life easier, bring us so little happiness? The simple answer runs because we have not yet learned to make sensible use of it. In other words, it's not enough to understand just what the applied science is and what the applied science does. We actually have to do something practical and tangible to improve ecological conditions, environmental health, and human well-being based on what we come to understand about it. And that's what we're doing here together, right? We're making sensible use of it. I started this morning by raising some of the grave challenges that are now facing humanity. But I also said that I believe that the importance of science and decision making was never really in question. I believe that firmly, and I believe that our commitment to science-based policies is now more important than ever. And that makes me really hopeful in spite of the magnitude of the challenges that we face. We're really having a moment now, I think. Can you imagine that each and every day now, the news cycle directly reinforces the need to rely on the best science to make decisions for the good of the American public? It's prominent in the news every single day. I don't ever remember that being true before. There's a presidential debate tonight where questions about the role of science in addressing monumental public health and climate change issues are going to be given priority attention. These topics are front and center in every single conversation about leadership at all levels of government now, across the entire country and even across the world every day. Imagine that. Next slide, please. Pope Francis even said recently that creation is groaning, and he urged humanity to view, quote, the disintegration of biodiversity and spiraling climate disasters as a wake-up call. He used those words to call the world to action on climate change and biodiversity. So the world is paying more attention than ever just now to how important the science is to quality of our lives. And that really gives me tremendous hope. I'm hopeful because in spite of our recent oh, by the way, I should point out that that's not actually a photo of the pontiff and myself arm in arm. That's a cardboard cutout of him, not of me. The photo was taken in the gift shop at National Geographic in DC. So anyway, I'm hopeful because in spite of our recent administrative challenges, the work of the LCCs, things like Nature's Network, all that work continues to be curated, updated, made accessible, and applied to address real conservation needs. Those efforts and investments are being protected and they're being put to use. We continue to fund new investigations too to meet science needs. We're still working every day to support our partners' priority science needs. And all of your work really gives me hope. I'm inspired because the pursuit of sound mutual science priorities continues in our institutions. Those of you on the ground are still out there doing the real work each and every day. So as we navigate the uncertainties before us together, speaking on behalf of resource managers and decision makers, we are grateful, I am grateful, to have the relationships that we do with the broader scientific community and especially academia to enable us to maintain precious public confidence in our work. The prospects of our ability to maintain public trust together seem really, really strong to me, and that is a good and hopeful thing because the scientific foundation for decision making in public policy has never, ever been more important than it is today. Last slide, please. So I thank you for the many contributions that each and every one of you makes to our work together. And thanks again for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. That's all I have.
That was wonderful. I don't know what the Zoom Snap Coffee House version is, but you can use your clap reaction or give a little wave to Mike. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike, for kicking off the 4th annual conference. I had a question, and then as you spoke, you actually answered it. And I just wanted to mention really quickly, I think the work and the understanding of the critical nature of regional buy-in for me as an educator and a person who, interprets science for the public, the idea of demonstrating relevance and, community engagement around these topics, especially at this moment, is so important. And I look forward to finding out more about the ability of different agencies to come together and build those frameworks to be able to communicate, build those regional connections. So thank you so much for talking so much about that. And I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for sure.
Yeah, please do. We actually are beginning also the process of a pretty involved communication strategy and plan. We're going to start within the Fish and Wildlife Service and within the Delaware Basin first, but we'll be broadening out shortly after we do that piece to include many of the key opinion leaders within the basin. And I certainly will remember to include you in that.
Yeah, I would love to know more. There's a question in the chat. I can read it out to you, Mike. Claire Billett would like to know, how will the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service resolve competing conservation values that cause tension in the conservation blueprint? For example, creating successional habitat for rare bird species versus the need to preserve intact mature headwater forests for water quality.
First of all, the protection of mature headwater forests for water quality goes hand in hand with the protection of habitat for many rare bird species. Not all of them, certainly. There are other rare bird species that require other kinds of forest structure, of course, but we're not going to be doing that exclusively and alone as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. One of the reasons that we prefer to work through networked partnerships like this is because, as a friend and colleague said on another Zoom call last week, I think, this is really about creating constellations, not about creating stars. So we're not really about creating stars when it comes to rare species. We want to focus on the constellations within which those stars exist. So focusing on habitats, on ecological processes, on functions that support the parameters, the habitat parameters that enable the populations of rare birds to continue to sustain themselves is really what we're going to be focused on. And we're going to be making those decisions when those tensions do arise, which we know that they sometimes will, in collaboration with one another. And we'll let the collective understanding of those really important science drivers drive for us the decision making by the group. Claire, I know we can count on you to be engaged in those discussions when the time comes, and we'll make those decisions together.
Wonderful. We've got 2 minutes left before we head out for our break. If anyone else has any questions, if you'd like to either use the raise hand function or type it into the chat. Otherwise, I think throughout the day, if that's correct, Catherine, people can add questions in the chat, pop your emails on there, and our scientists and other collaborators will be happy to get back to you. Good. Eric Sildorf would like to know, do you have any comments on the relative importance of terrestrial versus aquatic conservation?
Sure. Well, they're both important to us. I'm speaking just as a Fish and Wildlife Service official now. But I think in a lot of cases, what really drives what would seem to be differential levels of importance is actually where we have more data, where we have a greater scientific foundation to make more confident decisions about what to stress, what to focus on. We are clearly going to be including both. And that's why that composite slide that I showed, that even though it's at that big regional scale, that composite slide included both terrestrial and aquatic cores and connectors. And there were scientists in the appropriate areas of conservation science practice, the communities of practice that developed those independent layers and then came together and helped us figure out how to merge them. So we consider them co-equal. Sometimes it'll look like it's a little bit different where we have greater data to, richness to be able to make more informed decisions. But we certainly are keyed in on terrestrial habitats as well as aquatic habitats.
Wonderful. Well, it's 11 o'clock. The next session featuring 4 speakers will begin at 11:10. So everyone can go stretch, get a cup of, a cup of coffee or some socially, ethically, responsibly raised chocolate and have a quick stretch. So again, as we said, we just want to thank the folks for kicking off today. Mike, that was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, and I know everybody else here did too. But at any point, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we'll see you all at 11:10.